Even when Trump gets a lifeline, he somehow manages to screw it up. So here's the backstory, because it is essential in understanding the blunder that Trump just made today. Republican Senator Thom Tillis has publicly warned the Trump administration that he will not advance Trump's new pick for the Fed chair, that's Kevin Warsh, so long as Trump continues with his existing vindictive prosecution of the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell. Here's Tillis making that point.
No, I'm a pretty predictable person. I have said that we need to end the investigation, and I do hope that we'll have a turnover, even with Chair Powell rolling out sometime before the 2028 when his term expires. But look, the president, excuse me, Paula, on the night that I said that I was not going to move forward with a nom because of this investigation, the president said he wasn't aware of the investigation. DOJ moved unilaterally. DOJ needs to fix this problem.
Now, obviously, Trump wants his nominee, and obviously he knows that Tillis won't relent while he continues to prosecute Powell. So, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., led by Jeanine Pirro, because we live in hell, just announced that it would not move forward with its prosecution of Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Pirro wrote, quote, "This morning, the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve has been asked to scrutinize the building cost overruns in the billions of dollars that have been borne by taxpayers. The IG has the authority to hold the Federal Reserve accountable to American taxpayers. I expect a comprehensive report in short order, and I'm confident the outcome will assist in resolving, once and for all, the questions that led this office to issue subpoenas. Accordingly, I have directed my office to close our investigation as the IG undertakes this inquiry. Note well, however, that I will not hesitate to restart a criminal investigation should the facts warrant doing so." Now, I think it's pretty obvious what's happening here. Trump is going to pause the probe just long enough to get Kevin Warsh appointed, and then immediately thereafter, we'll see Powell get prosecuted again once Thom Tillis no longer has any leverage. Meaning they're trying to pull one over on Thom Tillis right now. Not very slick, but hey, maybe Tillis is willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, right? Well, I don't think after he heard Trump just say this today.
Jeanine Pirro to drop the investigation into Jerome Powell?
Well, I want to find out, it's not dropped. They're looking into the whole thing about
the IG.
What I want to look at, with the IG. What I want to look at is how can a building that I could have done for $25 million cost $4 billion? That's a big thing, and he was in charge. So we'll get to the bottom of it. Yeah, I think Jeanine is fantastic. And she worked with other people on that. I tell you, I want to find out. I have an obligation to find out. This was done during Biden, but I have an obligation to find out I would have done that building for $25 million, had money left over, and it would have been open a long time ago.
You or her people? Your people
I want to find out
it?
Because for the country, look, we have a railroad under construction in California. That's the worst thing I've ever seen under Gavin Newsom. And I want to find out why that one is costing 20 times what it was projected to cost. Likewise, the Fed building is I built a hotel in Washington, the Waldorf Astoria. I built it for $201 million. And I believe it's bigger than the Fed building. And you have bathrooms, you have a lot of, it's much tougher, much more expensive to build a hotel than an office. I want to find out how can a building of that size cost for whatever it's going to be. Nobody knows, by the way, what it's going to be. Kevin is going to be fantastic. Kevin Warsh, he may never get to be in that building.
Is it smooth sailing for him now? Will Tillis drop his block?
I would imagine it's smooth, but whether it is or not, somebody has to find out why that building that should have cost $25 million is costing billions of dollars.
What else?
And you know why they have to find it out? For other buildings, because that's not the only one.
I mean, how much more obvious could it get that Donald Trump is clearly not finished with Powell? He was given the opportunity to assuage concerns, and instead he went on a rage-filled rampage about Powell's purported criminality. At this point, if you think that Trump is truly not going to go for Powell's throat the second he has the opportunity to do so, you are living on another planet. And it's not just Trump. Yesterday, Caroline Leavitt did basically the same thing.
Go ahead. Ending the probe
Sure.
to Jerome Powell. Did the president sign off on that? What was his involvement, and why now after ratcheting up some of the rhetoric around that earlier this week?
As you saw, Judge Jeanine Pirro, or former Judge Jeanine, U.S. Attorney Jeanine now, put out a statement saying that the case is not necessarily dropped. It's just being moved over to the Inspector General, who has critical tools at their disposal to continue to look into the financial mismanagement at the Fed. This has obviously been a priority for the president. If you drive by the Fed building, the president has a point. This is a project that's been going on for a very long time. It's costing taxpayers billions of dollars, and I think it's in the best interest of the taxpayer to get to the bottom of it. So the investigation still continues. It's just under a different authority, and that's what you'll continue to see.
Quote, the case is not necessarily dropped. It's just being moved over to the Inspector General. This has been a priority for the president. The investigation still continues. It's just under a different authority. So at this point, their plan is so transparent that either they are daring Thom Tillis to defy them, or they think Thom Tillis is a moron with the judgment of a 3-year-old. Either way, not great. So I have 2 points to make here. The first is that Thom Tillis must not allow himself to be fooled by the White House's very obvious and transparent ploy. He should hold true to his own stated values and finish the fight that he started. And I hope that he sends a message to this administration and this country that it is actually possible to have even a shred of integrity in the modern Republican Party, because thus far, I'm not convinced. And second, zooming out, we 100% need to follow this administration up with actual consequences for federal officials who are abusing their office and law licenses to engage in these vindictive prosecutions. I don't care what we call it, the Nuremberg trials for prosecutorial misconduct, whatever. We need to make an example out of these people and ensure that this never happens again. And I've been on this beat for a long time, so much so that I literally included it as part of my blueprint for exercising power in the future in my new book, The Day After. Here's an excerpt from that book. Quote, restoring the rule of law starts with accountability for the corrupt officials who have perverted public service into a private profit machine. Inside the new Justice Department, there will need to be a special unit of prosecutors and investigators tasked with pursuing corruption cases throughout the Trump years. Not just to deliver justice to criminals, but to deter future corruption in later administrations. There were hundreds of prosecutions involved in the cases surrounding the January 6th insurrection. The corruption prosecutions for crimes committed during the second Trump term will surely involve similar numbers of prosecutors. However, they must move with more speed and determination than the Biden Justice Department. Merrick Garland put optics above justice. The opposite approach must be taken by the next Democratic Attorney General. And that book, The Day After, is available right now for pre-order. So if you've enjoyed my content over the years, I hope that it's okay that I ask you to support my work by pre-ordering this book. And if you live in a city where I'm doing my book tour, grab a ticket to see me live. All of that information is on the link in this screen and the post description and in the comments of that video. But clearly, the Trump administration feels emboldened to engage in these vindictive prosecutions expressly because there is no deterrent. Democrats have failed to step up and fight back in the past as aggressively as they need to, and the Republicans have clearly taken advantage. That can never happen again, and our job right now is to make 100% sure of that. Before you go, I'm very excited to announce that I've written a new book titled The Day After: How to Wield Power in a Post-Trump World. The book explores what is, in my opinion, the single most important theme that we're dealing with in politics today and moving forward: power. Specifically, how Republicans abuse it and how Democrats refuse to wield it. This book explains how we got here, and more importantly, how we should finally wield power if we're lucky enough to get it back. It is the blueprint for progressives who want to do far more than just restore the status quo. Please pre-order today by following the link on this screen. You can grab yours from any of the major retailers like Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or scroll down on the page and get a copy from an independent bookstore closest to you. Thanks so much for supporting independent media. You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have spoken a lot about the fact that Donald Trump, thanks to this new Supreme Court precedent, can't be held accountable for criminal activity, but we might have a major opening here where Donald Trump could be held accountable for civil wrongdoing in court, thanks to this new ruling that was just handed down by a judge. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, the presiding judge, Judge Amit Mehta in federal district court in D.C., has been litigating the question of whether police officers and Democratic lawmakers who were, in a very real sense, victims of Donald Trump's conduct on January 6th when he launched the Capitol attack, whether they can sue him for money damages. And the litigation that has been ongoing is Donald Trump's attempt to wiggle out of that lawsuit in a couple of ways, most directly by claiming, you know what? I've got presidential immunity from this civil suit, not just from the criminal charges that were brought against me for January 6th. There are slightly different tests involved, but they are largely the same. If he is engaged in core constitutional functions or official presidential acts, it is very hard to hold him accountable, either in a civil lawsuit or in the context of a criminal prosecution. Well, today, Judge Mehta ruled definitively in a 79-page judicial opinion that Donald Trump was not acting in his official capacity on January 6th when he gave that inflammatory speech on the ellipse, I call it, his pre-insurrection pep rally, in which he directed the angry mob to, fight like hell or you won't have a country anymore. Now go to the Capitol and stop the certification of Joe Biden's win. Stop the steal. And they did. And in the process, they beat the hell out of police officers. They, caused the members of Congress to be under siege, in the House chamber. And so now the civil suit that was brought literally years ago by the police, by the Democratic lawmakers, was just given a green light today because Judge Mehta ruled that these are not the official acts of a president. Far from it. They're the acts of a candidate trying desperately to cling to power after losing an election. And those kind of acts do not enjoy presidential immunity from being sued for the damage you inflicted. He also made some additional rulings. He said, listen, the words that you used, what you said in that pre-insurrection pep rally do not enjoy First Amendment speech. So he cleared the way for this case to proceed to trial. There are some caveats there, some qualifications. He said, listen, I'll give you an opportunity to appeal this decision in part. But as far as Judge Mehta is concerned, these are not presidential acts. These acts do not enjoy immunity. And Donald Trump can be tried in a civil case for creating the damage he created on January 6th.
Now, two questions here, and one counts on the other. So the first question is, what are Donald Trump's options to appeal this? And the second is, if he's unsuccessful at appealing, what could it mean for the parties that bring a case against Donald Trump?
So he did give Trump's lawyers the opportunity to appeal discrete portions of this ruling, and inevitably they will do that. So I don't pretend a trial is going to kick off in, a month, a couple of months. It may very well take another 6 months. It could take up to a year. But he did, in essence, sort of clear the runway for a trial in this case. The other important thing he did, Brian, is Donald Trump, as he has tried to do in the past, tried to weasel out of the case by having DOJ substitute itself as the defendant, which would mean that virtually the case would go away. It would end up being dismissed. But what the judge said was, no, it's only if these were official presidential acts within the scope of his presidential duties that DOJ can, come in and substitute itself and get Donald Trump out of the case altogether. Remember, Trump tried to do that in the E. Jean Carroll litigation, and judges denied his efforts to get out and substitute the Department of Justice as the defendant. Well, that was another important ruling by Judge Mehta. Donald Trump will remain in the case. DOJ cannot enter itself as the defendant and try to help Donald Trump get out of this hot water.
Now, in terms of the parties who are suing Donald Trump, what could we be looking at here in terms of a judgment?
Mega damages. I mean, if the jury finds Donald Trump liable for launching the Capitol attack and for inflicting the damage that was inflicted on the police officers and on the members of Congress. I mean, first of all, we remember how that mob was literally beating the hell out of, nearly beating to death, some of the police officers who were defending the Capitol that day. Some went on to die shortly after January 6th. I mean, just untold damages, money damages for pain and suffering, for emotional distress and turmoil. And, they are still, many of these officers are still suffering, not only psychologically, emotionally, mentally, but physically from the injuries that were inflicted by Trump's angry mob. Similarly, Brian, some of the members of Congress were under siege. I'm sure our viewers remember watching them literally cowering on the floor, hiding under the seats in the House chamber, trying to protect one another. There were some officers with guns drawn, pointing at the chamber's doors, in case people breached the chamber. I mean, that was a pretty emotionally impactful incident for these members of Congress. They suffered pain, suffering, mental anguish, and those things can be the subject of money damages. So it sure seems to me, Brian, like the sky's the limit with respect to what kind of money judgment a jury might enter against Donald Trump. And, even though we have been sort of dealing with these legal issues and steeped in things like, presidential immunity and the scope of Donald Trump's conduct that might be protected, I have to tell you, once this case moves into court, moves into trial proper, and there are 12 jurors sitting in that wooden box looking at what Donald Trump said and did to the people at the Capitol, both the officers and the members of Congress, and frankly, all of the employees at the Capitol that day, all of the visitors at the Capitol that day, they're probably not going to have a very difficult time, holding Donald Trump liable for what he did. But again, that trial is well off in the future at this point.
Glenn, could the damages that Trump sustained in the E. Jean Carroll case in any way inform what the damages might be in this instance?
No, that's apples and oranges. Those were allegations of defamation and sexual battery. That is a very different judgment against Donald Trump for what he did to E. Jean Carroll. So I don't think you can draw anything from the admittedly massive money judgments in two cases that were entered by juries against Donald Trump for what he did to E. Jean Carroll. But again, I think monetarily, as far as damages are concerned, the sky's the limit. And, that will be a hotly litigated issue if the jury finds that Donald Trump is, in fact, liable for damages.
And just a quick note for everybody who's watching right now, if you want to stay on top of this case and all other legal news, the best way to do that is to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put those links in the post description of this video. Glenn, it's worth asking here, does this have any bearing on the possibility of criminal charges in the future?
Well, Brian, I'm sure our viewers will remember that Donald Trump was being criminally prosecuted. He had been indicted for 4 felony crimes based on what he did on and around January 6, 2021. And when Donald Trump got elected to office the second time, you know what the posture of that criminal prosecution was? It was in court, and Judge Chutkan, who was presiding over the criminal case, was in the process of litigating whether those 4 criminal charges survived the Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling. I have to believe she would have ruled that, of course, these were private acts. They were acts of a candidate. They were not official acts of a president. And Brian, what do we now have? We now have another judge, Judge Amit Mehta, litigating virtually the same factual issue and reaching a conclusion that these were not presidential acts. So they're not covered by presidential immunity for purposes of a civil suit. Now, that does not constitute precedent. In other words, Judge Chutkan, in the future, in the event the Trump prosecution is revived after Trump leaves office, we can talk more about the feasibility of that in a minute. But, if Judge Chutkan, for example, presides over that case once again and has to litigate that issue, what Judge Mehta just ruled, that Donald Trump does not have presidential immunity from this civil suit, doesn't constitute precedent because one trial court judge is not obligated to follow the ruling of another trial court judge. However, the reasoning in Judge Mehta's 79-page ruling and the fact that the narrative, the incidents, the conduct of Donald Trump on and around January 6th is identical to what Judge Chutkan would have to litigate on the presidential immunity front in the criminal case. it is powerful, what I will call atmospheric precedent, because this ruling will absolutely help inform Judge Chutkan of what her ruling should be on the same facts. So this is a really important development, obviously, in the civil case, but potentially even in the future if, and this is a big if a future Department of Justice, once the rule of law comes back into the light of day, decides to try to rebring the criminal prosecution for those 4 felony charges on which Donald Trump stood indicted until he got elected the second time. You know, that will be a decision that a future attorney general, and that person better be a real justice warrior and go scorched earth in the direction of accountability for what Donald Trump has done to the American people. But it will be up to a future Department of Justice if they want to try to rebring that case. And if they do, we're going to be right back in court litigating once again the question of whether what Donald Trump did on January 6th should enjoy presidential immunity because these were official acts of a president. They weren't. Or whether they were the acts of a private person, the acts of a candidate trying desperately to retain power after losing an election that do not enjoy presidential immunity. So I think this is important both in the moment in the civil suit, and it may very well become very important in the future if the case is rebrought. And let me just finish this, this very long explanation by saying when Jack Smith decided he had to dismiss the January 6th criminal case against Donald Trump because he got reelected, and DOJ Office of Legal Counsel says it's not a good idea to prosecute a sitting criminal president. I disagree, but that happens to be the prevailing wisdom and practice at the Department of Justice. So Jack Smith had to move to dismiss that prosecution, but he did so without prejudice. That's a term of art, meaning Donald Trump can be re-indicted in the future on those same charges.
Last question here, Glenn. Does this decision by Judge Mehta, where he says that Donald Trump can be tried in this civil suit, does that offer any indication as to how a jury might rule in this case, or was this decision here solely about whether or not they're standing to even bring a case in the first place, given the fact that he's the sitting president?
Brian, it's a really interesting question. When Judge Mehta said, you were not acting in your official capacity as president, so you do not have immunity against being sued, and this case can proceed to trial. Does that have any bearing on how a jury might approach this case? I'm going to say yes and no. As a legal matter, the jury will never be told that this issue was litigated, that the judge ruled that Donald Trump does not have immunity from being sued in this case. They will never get to know that. In fact, during jury selection, they are told that if they have any prior knowledge about the case, they must be willing and able to completely put it out of their mind and decide the case based only on the evidence they see introduced during the trial, which can be challenging, but that's why jury selection can be very sort of long and fairly rigorous, because you want to make sure you have jurors that can be fair to both sides, both the plaintiff, the police officers, and the members of Congress, and the defendant who is now on trial in a civil case. But Judge Mehta said expressly in his opinion, look, you will be free to raise the issue of immunity again to the jury in the civil case. Once it's in trial, you can make that pitch. But as a legal matter, the judge said, it is not the kind of issue right now that I'm ruling on it, that means the case gets thrown out because you can't proceed to trial. You can try to raise that as a defense in front of the jury, but to kind of finish the answer to your question, it is a little bit of an indication that if the judge sees it that way, well, you know what? The jury might see it that way too when Donald Trump tries to raise the question of whether he was acting in his official presidential capacity or not. And again, once these cases move into court and are presented to juries, just like it took a very long time to get Donald Trump to trial in New York. And what happened? He was convicted of 34 felonies under the laws of New York, like in a New York minute by the jury. That's because usually those jurors are pretty clear-eyed, they are common sense oriented, and when you see the egregious conduct of Donald Trump on and around January 6th, you know, my money is riding on verdicts for the plaintiffs, and then it will be a question of damages. How much damage did Donald Trump do, and how much should a jury order him to pay the victims of his conduct?
All right, well, we will, of course, stay on top of this story for any more news. For those who are watching, if you'd like to stay on top of our legal analysis, the best way to do that is to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. I'm glad to be joined by Hakeem Jeffries. Thanks so much for joining me.
Good to be with you.
So we obviously had a major victory in